They told Kash Patel to leave, expecting him to get angry, but his response left the whole diner speechless. Kash Patel, the current FBI Director of the United States, had just finished a grueling day. He had been in Ohio, briefing the media on several high-profile cases that had gripped the nation's attention. The weight of his job pressed down on him like a heavy fog, clouding his mind with tension. All he wanted was a moment of peace, a brief escape from the relentless demands of his position. On his drive home, he spotted the Jefferson Diner, a small, unassuming spot in Ohio City where travelers often stop to rest, eat, or grab a coffee. Cash decided to pull over. He thought a cup of his favorite chocolate coffee might help him unwind before he reached home. Little did he know, this simple decision would lead to an encounter that would leave everyone in the diner stunned. Cash stepped out of his car and walked toward the diner. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and a few heads turned to glance at him. He was dressed in a sharp blue suit, his tie slightly loosened after the long day. His presence carried an air of authority, but his face showed the exhaustion of a man who had been carrying the weight of the nation's security on his shoulders. He scanned the room for an empty table and found one near the window. He walked over, pulled out a chair, and sat down, hoping for a quiet moment to himself. A young waitress approached his table, her name tag reading Emily. She had a polite smile on her face, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes as she looked at him. Cash didn't notice it at first. He was too focused on the thought of that warm chocolate coffee. He looked up at her and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "I'd like a chocolate coffee, please." Emily nodded, but her smile faltered for a moment. She hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the notepad in her hand. Then, without a word, she turned and walked toward the kitchen area. Cash watched her go, his instincts kicking in. He had spent years honing his ability to read people, and something about her behavior felt off. Her hesitation wasn't the kind you'd expect from a waitress taking a simple order. It was as if she had recognized him and wasn't sure how to proceed. He glanced around the diner, taking in the other patrons. There were a few families, a couple of truck drivers, and a group of young men sitting at a table in the corner. The atmosphere felt tense, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The murmurs of conversation seemed to quiet slightly as eyes darted in his direction. Emily returned a few minutes later, but she wasn't carrying a coffee cup. Her expression was apologetic, but there was a firmness in her tone that caught Cash off guard. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't serve you," she said, her voice low but clear. Cash raised an eyebrow, his mind racing to process her words. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Could you please call the owner of the diner? I'd like to speak with him." Emily nodded and disappeared again, this time heading toward the back of the diner. Cash sat back in his chair, his hands resting on the table. He could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him now. Their curiosity piqued. The tension in the room was palpable, and he sensed that this wasn't just about a cup of coffee. Something deeper was at play here, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. A man emerged from the back, walking toward Cash's table with a purposeful stride. He was middle-aged, with a weathered face and a slight limp in his step. His name tag identified him as Jefferson, the owner of the diner. He stopped in front of Cash's table, his expression a mix of discomfort and resolve. "Yes, sir. How can I—" Jefferson's words cut off mid-sentence as he looked at Cash, and recognition dawned in his eyes. He straightened up, his tone shifting to one of forced politeness. "I'm sorry, but we can't serve you. I don't want any trouble or arguments here. You know the decorum of the diner." Cash didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pulled out a chair from the table and sat down, his movements deliberate and composed. He wasn't about to let this go so easily. Behind him, a young boy at another table let out a loud laugh, drawing the attention of the other patrons. The boy was laughing at a joke he had just received on his phone, but the sudden sound broke the tension in the room for a brief moment. All eyes turned to him, but just as quickly, the attention shifted back to Cash as he began to speak. "Tell me, Jefferson, why don't you want to serve me?" Cash's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that demanded an answer. Jefferson shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the diner as if looking for support. "It's not me," he said finally. "It's the diner. You can see the resentment. The whole diner is chanting for you to go out." Cash followed Jefferson's gaze, taking in the expressions of the other patrons. Some looked hostile, others curious, but there was a clear undercurrent of unease in the room. Cash's mind worked quickly, piecing together the situation. He had been in enough high-stakes situations to recognize when a room was turning against him. He sensed that this diner had, for the moment, become a sort of unofficial Democrats' zone. It wasn't a political rally, but the sentiment in the air was unmistakable. The patrons, or at least some of them, had recognized him as the FBI director appointed under a controversial administration, and they weren't happy about his presence. Before Jefferson could say more, the young boy who had laughed earlier stood up from his table. He was in his early 20s, with a cocky grin on his face. "Tell me, Kash Patel, are you the director of the FBI or Trump?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. The question hung in the air, and the diner fell silent. All eyes were on Cash now, waiting to see how he would respond. Cash turned his head slightly to look at the boy, his expression unreadable. He understood the implication behind the question. The boy wasn't just asking about his role. He was challenging Cash's loyalty, his integrity, and his very presence in the diner. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Cash knew he had to choose his words carefully. He wasn't just representing himself in this moment. He was representing the FBI, the government, and the principles he had sworn to uphold. "I'm Kash Patel, director of the FBI," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I serve the United States of America, not any one person. My job is to protect this country and its people, regardless of who they voted for." The boy's grin faltered slightly, but he didn't sit down. Cash continued, his tone steady and measured. "I came here for a cup of coffee, not a fight. But if you're asking me to leave because of who I am or what I represent, then I'd like to understand why." The room remained silent, the weight of Cash's words settling over the patrons like a heavy blanket. Jefferson shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this was going. The boy who had spoken up sat back down, his bravado fading in the face of Cash's composed response. Emily, the waitress, stood off to the side, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she watched the exchange. Cash turned his attention back to Jefferson. "You said the diner doesn't want me here, but I'd like to hear it from them." He raised his voice slightly, addressing the room at large. "If anyone here has a problem with me being here, I'd like to know why. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just a man trying to have a cup of coffee after a long day." For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint hum of the diner's air conditioning. Then a woman at a nearby table spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. "We know who you are," she said. "We've seen you on the news. You work for him, for Trump. And we don't want that here. This is our space, and we don't want politics in it." Cash nodded slowly, taking in her words. He understood her perspective, even if he didn't agree with it. "I hear you," he said, "but I'm not here as a politician. I'm not here to talk about Trump or anyone else. I'm here because I've had a long day, and I wanted a moment to relax, that's all. I'm not asking for your vote or your approval. I'm asking for a cup of coffee." The woman didn't respond, but her expression softened slightly. Cash's words had a disarming effect, cutting through the hostility in the room. He wasn't angry or defensive, as they might have expected. Instead, he was calm, reasonable, and willing to listen. It was a response that caught them off guard, and it shifted the dynamic in the diner. Jefferson spoke up again, his tone less confrontational this time. "Look, I don't want any trouble," he said. "I just want to keep the peace here. If people are uncomfortable, I have to respect that." Cash nodded, understanding the position Jefferson was in. "I respect that," he said. "But I'd like to ask one thing before I go." He turned to the room again, his gaze sweeping over the patrons. "If I've done something to personally offend any of you, I'd like to know what it is. If not, then I'd ask you to consider whether it's fair to judge me based on assumptions about who I am or what I represent." The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't tense or hostile, it was reflective. The patrons exchanged glances, some of them looking down at their plates or cups, as if reconsidering their initial reactions. The young boy who had challenged Cash earlier shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence replaced by a thoughtful expression. Cash stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at Jefferson and nodded. "I'll leave," he said, "but I hope you'll think about what I said. I'm not your enemy. I'm just a man doing my job, trying to make this country a safer place for everyone." With that, he turned and walked toward the door, the bell jingling again as he stepped outside. The diner remained silent for a long moment after he left. The patrons sat in their seats, processing what had just happened. Kash Patel, the director of the FBI, had been asked to leave, and instead of reacting with anger or indignation, he had responded with a calm dignity that left them all speechless. His words had challenged their assumptions, forcing them to confront their own biases. And in that moment, the Jefferson Diner, for all its temporary political fervor, was left with a lingering sense of introspection. As Cash got back into his car and drove away, he couldn't help but reflect on the encounter. He had faced hostility before, but this was different. It wasn't a courtroom or a press conference. It was a small diner in Ohio, a place where people were supposed to feel at ease. Yet even here, the divisions in the country were starkly evident. He sighed, his mind still heavy with the weight of his responsibilities. The chocolate coffee would have to wait for another day. For now, he turned his focus to the road ahead, knowing that his work was far from over.